On today's video, we enter the notorious neighborhood of Crime Manor in Fort Myers. This community has had this name for decades, but recently conditions here are worse than they've ever been. And as you can see, the neighborhood has been abandoned. On today's video, we're going to discover why. This neighborhood is located in South Fort Myers, an area known for having road raging drivers, angry people. Interestingly, the word manor refers to a large country estate. However, the irony is that these are some of the most densely populated neighborhoods that exist in South Florida. The hypocrisy of the name of this community by itself is unreal, and the fact that nobody calls it Pine Manor, everybody calls it Crime Manor, only attests to the reputation this neighborhood has. Perhaps you've driven right past this neighborhood on US 41 and noticed all the junkies and crackheads riding bicycles down the road, or perhaps you even noticed people sleeping on the sidewalks and businesses here. Perhaps if you even noticed this gas station where people are always vagrantly hanging out. Many times people are panhandling here aggressively. All this is visible from US 41. When entering the neighborhood, the first thing you notice now is for rent signs, evictions, and the fact that the neighborhood looks like a complete freaking ghost town. And you're asking yourself, isn't Fort Myers one of the fastest growing communities in the United States? Why are people leaving complete neighborhoods abandoned in Fort Myers if, after all, Fort Myers is one of the fastest growing cities in the United States? As you can see, these neighborhoods are completely empty. The population density here was some of the highest of anywhere in South Florida, but now entire blocks are empty with only about 20 or 30% of these buildings looking to be completely occupied. And if conditions in this neighborhood were bad before, they just became infinitely more complicated. Let me explain to you why. The state of Florida implemented SB 1718, a law that targeted illegal immigrants. Most of the construction, if not the entire workforce of labor in the Fort Myers area, related to the area's fast-growing population, was directly related to illegal immigrant labor, because after all, none of these companies are paying the workers enough money to where a U.S. citizen would even consider taking a job building houses in the Florida heat for salaries that are not even enough to make it here. In fact, the only reason these people were able to make it here is because they would live up to 15 people in a single unit, meaning that the smell coming out of these properties that are being evicted right now is absolutely appalling. These homes were meant to be for single persons, but because of the appreciation of real estate prices, now up to 15 people have to live in a single unit just so they can be able to afford the rents. If it wasn't for the fact that these people were packed like sardines into these ghetto duplexes, they couldn't really afford to live in Southwest Florida because the salaries that get paid here are not enough to afford housing. But we all know that because of the increasing amount of homelessness that we're seeing in Southwest Florida, in particular places like Fort Myers. An area where many of the homeless people aren't even addicts, they're elderly people who can't afford to live anymore. But now that the workers are gone, the only thing left roaming these neighborhoods is homeless people and vagrants. But there's a new law in Florida that's going to stop squatting. Here's the new problem. If there are this many vacant properties, they're not going to be permanently squatting one property. They're going to be hopping from one empty house to the next, leaving behind a trail of destruction that the property owners are not going to be able to manage because, after all, these are investment properties and the owners might live in Montreal or New York City and they're nowhere near these properties, which means that with this many vacant housing units in this neighborhood of Fort Myers, we're not going to be seeing any homeless camps anymore. We're going to see homeless people break from one empty house to the next, leaving behind a trail of destruction. And the reason we know this is because in Fort Myers, many years ago when I worked in Fort Myers and there were more empty houses, that is exactly what the homeless population would do. They would go from one house to the next, and they wouldn't exactly be squatting. They would just be picking a house that was empty for the night and sleeping there. Many times they would even defecate in the floors, even though the houses had running water. I know that because I went into these properties and cleaned them for a living many years ago, and every single morning morning, when we went into these properties, we would have to go in with several males armed with bats because sometimes the homeless people would still be inside the properties. Now, this problem literally became eliminated when the amount of people moving to Southwest Florida increased and finding vacant properties was almost impossible. But now that there are so many vacant houses in Fort Myers, because all the illegals left and nobody's moving to the state of Florida for several reasons, the new squatting laws will be absolutely unenforceable because the homeless population will have so many places to choose from for them to sleep for the night that they won't actually have to quote-unquote squat in one particular place. They'll just move from one place to the next endlessly, and that is a problem that plagued the city of Fort Myers before the appreciation of real estate prices, and everybody wanted to be here. But right now, as you drive through this sad-looking neighborhood, the only thing that's evident is the amount of evictions, the amount of garbage being cleaned out of these properties, and the fact that the neighborhood looks empty. As evening was approaching, we noticed the homeless people just walking around looking for empty houses to squat for the night, and this is going to be the problem for these property owners, a problem that didn't really exist when the real estate demand was so high. But now that Florida is losing that demand for real estate and that all the illegals are leaving, we're seeing so many empty properties that the homeless people are literally going to be hopping from one empty house to the next, which means that the state's new squatting laws are going to do absolutely nothing to prevent this problem from happening, because law enforcement, for one, isn't going to go from duplex to duplex that's empty to see where the homeless people are sleeping. This is a public problem that has now been shifted to the private sector, and the people that bought these investment properties thinking that they were going to make a huge money are not going to find homeless people living inside of these properties and, of course, defecating inside of them. There's even people living inside of sheds in these communities, inside vehicles, inside vans. If you really look carefully to know what to look for, you realize that the living conditions in this neighborhood are absolutely abysmal. And that is because Southwest Florida and the entire state of Florida in general has really failed to create jobs that pay enough money. Other states like California and New York that have the same cost of housing now have incomes that are considerably higher than the state of Florida. But the state of Florida has the high cost of real estate, but there aren't any industries that can support the cost of living, making the state of Florida one of the most transient places to live in the United States. Raising the next question of who is actually going to rent a duplex, even if the prices did come down in a neighborhood like this, plagued by homelessness, addiction, homicide. Most people would rather pay more money to live in a better neighborhood, which means that if you don't have an exploitable poor population willing to live in neighborhoods like this, then these neighborhoods are practically going to become ghost towns, abandoned places where the homeless can just go from house to house that's abandoned, similar like to what you have in Louisiana or in Detroit, where the homeless people isn't exactly visible out in the open because there's so many vacant properties to choose from. And that is the direction that these neighborhoods in Fort Myers are heading. So we can say that at least the implementation of these laws as of now have had very little positive effect on the state of Florida. If the state of Florida was on the up and coming like a state like California, then it would make sense to get rid of the immigrant population, as real estate values would become increasingly attractive. But with the current situation that people have stopped moving to Florida, it doesn't really make sense to also get rid of the bottom, the working class people, because now you have a void and a bigger divide between the haves and the have-nots. Indeed, if Florida was heading into a housing crisis similar to what you have in California, where real estate is very expensive, then these types of laws could possibly make sense. How disadvantaged is the neighborhood of Pine Manor? As you can see here, they don't even have a light to exit the neighborhood, which means that people actually traverse through this parking lot behind businesses and use that as an exit for the neighborhood. Because if you're heading north on US 41, there's literally no lights to go into the neighborhood. This neighborhood doesn't even have a viable way in and out. All you see are these gas stations and few businesses, but even entering and exiting the neighborhood is a nightmare. If real estate demand was high in the state of Florida, and these properties were going to get filled in with working class people, then that would make perfect sense. But if these properties are going to become vacant and just going to be used for squatting by homeless people who are going to eventually destroy every single unit that's empty for longer than a few weeks, It only raises questions of how really are these new laws coming to Florida gonna be effective when you have an ever-changing landscape in the state of Florida. These laws were created with the intentions of the state's population booming, but now that the state's population is coming to a freeze, some of these landlords are going to be wishing they had somebody squatting on their property they could at least extort for $50 a month, because what's coming to these vacant properties is going to be an absolute annihilation by the homeless population, especially now with the pending new law of the homeless population in Florida, where they're going to be arrested for sleeping outdoors. The chronic homeless population in Florida, we've already spoke to them, and they're telling us if we're going to get arrested for sleeping on the sidewalk, then we might as well start breaking into properties. And with so many empty properties now in the state of Florida in poor neighborhoods because of SB 1718 and the fact that the illegal immigrants left, we're going to start to see the homeless population start squatting these neighborhoods. And that is the unfortunate situation on the streets of Fort Myers, Florida. Things really are going from bad to worse here. You may have noticed that driving around this neighborhood, there were several central air conditioning units that were out by the curb. And that is what happens in Southwest Florida when things get bad. People start to steal the coils from the air conditioners to sell them for scrap metal. Now, many years ago, when this was happening after the recession, the state of Florida implemented laws that are still vigilant to this day regarding to the theft of copper coils from air conditioners. But the law came into play way too late. By the time the law was actually being implemented, the wave of air conditioning thefts was already over. And perhaps that's the problem with law in Florida, that by the time the laws are implemented, the landscape changes, and the original purpose of these laws is no longer a viable thing to persecute. Perhaps that is what's happening already in the state of Florida with the new squatting, homeless laws, and immigration laws, that already the intended purpose of these laws is no longer relevant with the changes in the state taking place so quickly. Now there's new problems that are going to require new measures, endless cycle of laws that are ineffective, don't work, and don't have their intended purposes.